start. Find seats. We have plenty of seats in here. We also have seats in the living room and the dining room if you want to be a little bit more spaced out. That is totally fine. Hello. Welcome. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is say we are here to celebrate 1960, this book by Al Filreis. Can we all clap?
1960, a good year.
What's that?
It was a good year.
It was a good year. It was a good year. I have to say, it's not often that we get together to celebrate Al, especially not for his work as a scholar and a writer. And so this feels really important. I'm really glad we can gather today. I'm glad gathering is still possible. I want to open this gathering with a land acknowledgement. We here at Kelly Writers House recognize that every gathering of people at Kelly Writers House does so on the indigenous territory known as Lenapehoking, the traditional homelands of the Lenape, also called Lenni Lenape, or Delaware Indians. These are the people who, during the 1680s, negotiated with William Penn to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. Their descendants today include the Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, Ramapo Lenape, Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. Okay, here's what we plan to do tonight. We'll have about an hour and 15 minutes in here. Al will say a few words. He'll read from the book, which is very exciting. Charles Bernstein and Laynie Browne will share some of their initial thoughts, and then we'll have a conversation. I think the conversation might include you. These are talkers, so.
Only one of the three of us is a talker.
We can vote later on who that is. And then after we're in here for about an hour and 15 minutes, we'll go outside. We do have yummy things to eat from De Bruno's. We have some cupcakes. We have some drink. We have some heaters. So if it's cold, you can gather around the heaters, although I know it's a pretty good day for this.
57 degrees.
57 degrees. We're lucky. We're lucky. Okay, so that's the plan. There will be gathering outside. And again, if you're uncomfortable in here, we have space over in the living room and the dining room, which is a little more space. Okay, so I think these three people need very little introduction. I'm going to introduce them super briefly. This is Laynie Browne. Laynie is a poet, prose writer, teacher, and editor. We've been so happy to have her here full-time at Writers House, co-teaching with Al, which is amazing. I put in a plug for her special new book, or special plug for her new book, but I reversed that special plug for her new book. It's an anthology of essays on the poet's novel called A Forest of Many Stems, and we'll have an event here in February for that. Then we have Charles Bernstein, a poet, essayist, editor, scholar, co-founder of Penn Sound.
The new issue of Boundary 2 devoted entirely to
Charles Bernstein. Amazing.
Although they put him on the back.
Oh, I love it. And another plug, his new book is Topsy Turvy, which has been described as expansive and unruly, words which I would say also describe Charles Bernstein. And then, of course, there's Al Filreis. He is the founder and director of this place.
You're the director. I'm the faculty director.
I'm sorry. He's the faculty director, and that's how it works. He was recently honored with the Penn Alumni Faculty Award of Merit, which is a huge honor and amazing. Yes, we got some snaps. He's a generous mentor. I can say that. I've been here 20 years. He is a generous mentor. He's a scholar. He's a writer. And I say this a lot, but I think he bends space and time. I think that's actually his secret talent, because I don't see how, with everything he does for people, for this place, he wrote a book, and a serious one, archival. He's in it. So we're here now to celebrate that achievement. So we're here now in this place he built to celebrate this book he made. So please, everybody, one more round of applause.
Thank you, Jessica. Couple of quick thank yous, and then I want to read a few pages from this book. And then my buddies here, my colleagues, each have written a short piece in response to the book, and then they're going to ask me questions, and most of them are going to reflect back, I'm sure. And that's never happened to you. And then there'll come a time when we would, have a conversation with you folks. I just want to point out that we've been running programs lately because of the weather. We've been going indoors, but we've been running programs all fall, and we haven't had a turnout like this, so I'm really honored and appreciative. We've had lots of, Amber Rose, you made it to campus. Amber Rose is like boycotting campus, and then now she's here. We haven't had a crowd like this, so I appreciate the fact that we have really good circulation. It's almost like an airplane. And you have your masks on. Ours are off, but we're a little distant. And there really is, as Jessica says, some room. We have chairs in the other room. We have another screen in the other room. You can go all the way back. We renovated this room so the sound goes to the kitchen. So please feel free to move in and out as you need to. So thank you. A couple of quick thank yous. Jessica put a lot of, where did she go away from the room? Probably, typically.
She can hear you.
Jessica Lowenthal, she can hear me. Yes, that's what I said. Jessica put a huge effort into this and has been very anxious about, it coming off. And we had too many RSVPs for safety, and of course it's COVID, so 20% of the people, decide that it's not good to venture out. So we ended up with the perfect number, and it's great. So this is a way of thanking Jessica for the super organization, and Allie and the rest of the staff for what they did. So let's put our hands together for them. My book is dedicated to a few people. One of them is my wife, Jane Truhaft, who is here, and I'm really glad. There's something in this book, something in that dedication about patience and tolerance. And also Jane, who designs books, Philip approved this, likes this cover. So, and that's not an easy thing. She did not like the last design of the last book, but this one worked out. And that leads me to my final thank you for the moment, which is Philip Leventhal, my editor from Columbia University Press, who came from New York. And there he is. Raise your hand, Philip. I loved working with Philip. Wow, a real editor in 2020, 2021. Jim Ming's like, I've had a few non-editors in my time. I have too. And Philip, you are a rare thing. I don't know. Are they all, are you the only one left? Anyway, you don't answer that. You gave me, you gave me rope to hang myself. You let me run out there. You also then said, you could probably take some pages out of this. You were very nice about it all. And it was great working with you. So thank you. All right, so I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from the preface, and then I'm going to read a section from chapter 7, the first section. This is a book that is so full of convergences and non-hierarchical exposition every which way that there's no way to read a few pages without completely confusing people. You have to read the whole book, which is not really a selling point, is it? But anyway, I picked a passage at the beginning of chapter 7 to read, and I think it'll be maybe even a little fun. It's about Rod Serling. Everybody likes Rod Serling, so all right. Yeah, you've even got the theme song. Is it okay if I sit and read? Can you see me and hear me? Okay. This is a book about how in the year 1960 artists turned back to the war of 1939 to 45, and in a way that was new to the horror and mass killings of that period. In one sense, it is a study of deferred retrospection of the complex and compelling reasons for that belatedness. It is also an inquiry into the start of the 60s, a re-radicalization marking the end of the supposed end of ideology in the 50s. And yes, I do think what we call the 60s began in the year 1960. As such, this work of interpretation continues the literary historical analysis I set out in a book called Counter-Revolution of the Word, The Conservative Attack on Modern Poetry, 1945 to 1960. except that here, poetry, although a major focus, is only part of the story, especially in chapters 4 through 10, the second part of the book. The avant-garde explored here is more generational than generic and is broadly defined. Many of the artists encountered in these pages were a few years too young to have experienced the left-right arguments waged in the 1930s, too junior in the 1940s to feel responsible for the war's tragedies. Many of them are born in 1930, so they're 15 in 1945. Perfect age to not really be much responsible for the horrors of the war, but to have experienced it. They create their projects to turn away from de-radicalization in many genres in addition to poetry, fiction, theater, film, memoir, sculpture, especially assemblage, teleplays, painting, sci-fi, fantasy, musical theater, and in the end, jazz. The book is meant through its organization and at times non-hierarchical exposition, it's an understatement, to emphasize the crossing and interrelation implied by such a generic range and to feature a patient elaboration or refrain of themes across otherwise heterogeneous works dealing with trauma, exile, exophony, disaster, racist hatred, and testimony. To make my argument, the materials, projects, and artists it features recur throughout chapters. James Baldwin appears and reappears and then returns in the final section of chapter 10 on John Coltrane as supposedly a, quote, angry young tenor. Baldwin in the book's opening pages faces the same assumptions of anger that Coltrane encounters in the end, at the beginning of Beyond, a phrase used to describe Coltrane, heading into the 1960s. Appearances of Paul Celan, Hannah Arendt, Jerome Rothenberg, Franz Fanon, Ingeborg Bachmann, Amiri Baraka, and others function similarly. 1960, when art and literature confronted the memory of World War II and remade the modern. That is a mouthful. Philip, are we still happy about that title? Yeah. It's a long title. 1960, when art and literature confronted the memory of World War II and remade the modern, is a study of the future of memory as reckoned at a moment of time. What does it mean for an avant-garde, nominally a trailblazing group ahead of its epoch, to be looking not ahead, but at least initially backward to the past? In this context, I refer variously to forms of modernism: modernist anti-fascism, the modernist poetics of witness, anti-communist modernism, that's my favorite, anti-modernism, etc. Then, too, there was the renewed embrace of modernism as a counter to the brutal fascist equation of modernism and Jewishness that had supported Nazi efforts to eliminate both supposed degeneracies through one aggression, as both together, modernist and Jew, created, quote, and now quoting Nazis, informal Bolshevistic attempts to destroy the inner balance. Such various senses of the modern and of complex post-war motives for reaffirming it, its non-transparency, its non-narrativity, its metatextuality, qualities all deemed degenerate by the anti-modernist extreme right during the nightmare years, will be delineated in context throughout this telling. But insofar as an overall prefatory definition of these related plural modernisms can be helpful as a guide, it is especially because post-war detractors of modern art continued to attack all its connotations, and because the artists presented in this book looked back and embraced pre-war experimental groups and movements in order indeed to defy fascist destructions, but also to resist the de-radicalizing efforts of these Cold War detractors. Thus, modernism here is certainly a historical category, the defining of which encouraged a positive retrospective on the part of radicals of 1960, the revolt against representational transparency that came to stand for the previous pre-war era and its artistic movements prior to fascism's suppressions. My earlier book details the post-war de-radicalization against which the artists in this new book respond. At times, modernism for them is an art whose most heretical processes can be restored with a hopefulness best explained by its readiness to confront the war experience. The chapter on the zero artists is one of the places in this book where the case for counterintuitive and doubly negative hope is made explicitly. They, quote, the zero artists, quote, opposed the anti-everything. in a manner that helps describe many otherwise quite different artists whose work is explored in thenceforth in chapters 6 through 10. Artists and works not typically associated with such an ultimately positive view, such as Primo Levi of The Truce, Roberto Rossellini, returning in It Was a Night in Rome to the liminality of that beloved city under fascist occupation, Louis Zukofsky, not known for hopefulness, in a new installment of his epic poem A, as he wanders past the site of traumatic triangle shirtwaist factory fire, John Coltrane venturing an unironic reckoning of favorite things, Shari Deans doing buoyant rubbings of sewer grates, Bob Kaufman writing Afrobeat verse in jail after brutalization at the hands of the police, Rod Serling in otherwise depressing early Twilight Zone scripts, Jean Tinguely insisting that homage to New York, his assemblage which was designed to be destroyed, that's what I say here actually, insisting that homage to New York, a sculpture at MoMA created to be destroyed, symbolized the opposite of suicide. So now I'm going to read a few pages from chapter 7. The chapter is called Disaster Defies Utterance, and it is a quote from Aaron Appelfeld, who wrote his first stories and published them around this time. The first section that I'm going to read, the section I'm going to read is the first section of the chapter, and it's called Words Help Make the Silences. You're going to hear about the Zero artists, particularly Otto Pien. You're going to hear about Paul Celan, who is a major character in the beginning of this book, who has written a lot about silence, to say the least. You'll hear again about Jean Tinguely, Homage to New York, I mentioned a minute ago. Rossellini's film, It Was a Night in Rome. And you're going to hear a reference to Danny Ocean. Jim English, who's Danny Ocean? What?
I can't place it.
Irwin?
EO11.
Yeah, Ocean's 11, Danny Ocean, the main character. Ocean's 11 is a Rat Pack 1960 film that I deigned to read seriously in this book. There's only a brief mention here of Danny Ocean. And De Sica's film, Two Women, is mentioned also. And I think that's all the references you need. Okay, here we go. A tail gunner in the Army Air Corps, the creator of A Canticle for Leibowitz, 1960, flew more than 50 bombing missions over Italy just as Danny Ocean and his colleagues drop into Anzio, fictionally, of course, Frank Sinatra. Rossellini's trio of Allied soldiers elude fascist spies in Rome awaiting liberation, and De Sica's protagonist Shazira and the daughter she tries to protect cower in a small village a few miles in between. Positioned in the tail gunner's exposed aerial outpost, that vulnerable front row seat, Walter M. Miller flew the infamous mission that dropped 1,400 tons of high explosives onto the medieval Benedictine abbey at Monte Cassino. The bombing caused the total destruction of the building built in 529 AD, as well as art, archives, and unique manuscripts the Germans had not yet removed. An atrocious tactical error, the abbey was unoccupied and served scant military purpose that the Allies would not officially concede until 1961, just months after A Canticle for Leibowitz was published. Even a devout anti-fascist diarist in Rome, her witnessing forms the basis of Rossellini's film of 1960, was appalled by news in December 1943 of the forced evacuation by the Nazis of the Cassinese, the people of Cassino people, who ahead of the American attack had no choice and no time, and by photographs of the destruction placarded around the city in early 1944. By every account, Miller suffered pervasive trauma as a result of this gratuitous bombing and remained always thereafter, quote, a tortured person. He was, quote, deeply depressed by post-traumatic stress disorder, said a friend of his, and had been for a half-century. This state of mental ill health inspired but was by no means resolved through the writing of the novel about a nightmarish, ruined world in which survivors struggle piece by piece to comprehend the language of the shreds of remnant archive, which, quote, has been reduced to archaeological ambiguity. The new abbey in this novel is formed from the ruins that had been caused by the great flame deluge. How many of you read this book, Canticle for Leibowitz? Oh my gosh. not too many. The monks study bits of survivor testimony, disjunctive texts that Miller dubs versicles. These texts survive the demise of an ordinary 20th century Jewish engineer named Isaac Leibowitz. Walker Percy described a canticle for Leibowitz itself as a, quote, cipher, a coded message, a book in a strange language. Yet Percy contended this language is a code with a special atrocity-caused difference. It is about, and as a work of writing, is itself a secret that cannot or does not want to be told. The book is a survivor's X. Telling it ruins it. That's a quote. Telling it ruins it. Walker Percy meant ruins in every sense. As, quote, the medieval reprise emerges from slow increased mastery of pre-deluge English, the post-Holocaust reconstitution of a writing culture becomes the central theme. Miller's novel seems itself to be such a reconstitution. It could be said to be, and to be about, the new, necessarily disjunct language that must survive destruction. Focus on the infelicities of the old language is acute and at times darkly comic. But what of a triple appositive like fallout, survival, shelter? The apprentice, Brother Francis, muses upon being led to versicles inscribed in an ancient shelter whose bland, Cold War era organizational American English, quote, once sealed, the hatch will be automatically unlocked by the servo monitor system when, but not before, any of the following conditions prevail, etc., puts the lie to the doomed notion of a sealed environment. The phase called the simplification was necessary. The phase called the simplification was necessary, but syntheses, hybridities, and interoperabilities, Miller's main modes will succeed. The will to bear witness is strong in Miller's vision of the cultural effect following the flame deluge of Monte Cassino and like destructions. For the composer of the versicles constituting his novel, writing is not a matter of survivor testimony. Quote, and this is, I believe, Walker Percy, the miraculous contraptions of the ancients were not to be carelessly tampered with, as many a dead excavator of the past had testified with his dying gasp. As in testimony to genocide, it is about something that happened, in Walker Percy's phrase for the book, an opaque Jewish something, discoverable along, quote, Jewish coordinates, an esotericist's gnosis. Percy uses the word gnosis. That which cannot be properly said and is best left improper and unruly. Among the several interoperabilities obsessing Miller was the generic. His book about, in quotes, about World War II, another of the many war novels of 1960, defining that global conflict as the origin of the concept of total disintegration, belongs as much to the tradition of political allegory, the same tradition preoccupying Arendt when she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, as to science fiction. The novel's relationship as allegory to the death of humanism and paltry possibilities of its revival might have struck audiences seeing Orson Welles' direction of Ionesco's play Rhinoceros in the spring of 1960, or readers of the Grove Press publication, also published in 1960, as eerily aligned with the parabolic conversions in Miller's book. Rhinoceros was similarly about the war in retrospect and the utter failure of humanism. As we will see momentarily, Rhinoceros restages Camus' The Plague. Camus makes an earlier appearance in this book, in which the spread of a pandemic is equated to that of fascism. By merging deadly serious political allegory with an absurd fantasy of transmogrification in which centrists moving rightward turn into rhinos. In A Canticle for Leibowitz, there are absurd, fabulistic aspects, and following Mary Shelley's The Last Man, its global crisis is likened to a human sickness that reduces world population to one shepherd, a Jewish one. And thus, like the plague, it encoded a post-war life as a pandemic aftermath. Miller's fable is signaled with the appearance of the old wandering Jew, who might be Isaac Leibowitz himself, saying in stereotypical nasal bleat the blessing over his tiny piece of bread, hamotzi. in a language the Leibovitz acolyte recites but doesn't comprehend, Hebrew. As in Rod Serling's work, the strangeness of whose allegories always turn in the end on a darkly comic pun, misprision, or parapraxis, as in Ionesco, whose rhino-fascists are monsters that don't naturally belong in the French countryside, unless animal life too has been altered by corrosive sociogeny. Miller's allegory of wartime and post-war culture extends the absurd idea that a middling Jewish engineer who designed obviously malfunctioning bomb shelters could be transformed into a saintly object of post-Holocaust messianic Jewish Catholic hope. Such absurdist allegorical wartime readings remain wide open. The anthropology is both radical and overt, which is what Walker Percy says about the novel. The audience is aptly uncomprehending. These disparate texts of 1960 centrally thematize ideological interpretation itself. Historical understanding need not be thwarted by, and anyway cannot be derived from, linguistic disjunction or narrative misdirection. Ionesco's Rhinoceros is often read as an allegorical response to fascism as a social movement in the period immediately before the war. By having citizens of a small provincial French town turn outwardly into rhinoceroses rather than inwardly into fascists, the play explores its themes of conformity, culture, and mass movement. One citizen of the town, the persuasion of fascism coming over him, argues with an anti-fascist friend, screaming, "Humanism is all washed up. You're a ridiculous old sentimentalist," whereupon he transforms into a rhino and tries to trample the other. Earlier, when the very first misplaced monstrous rhinoceros rumbles through the center of town, the man who would later become one himself, an incipient fascist concerned at this point only with law and order and with keeping the economy open, turns to his liberal humanist friend, seeking his response. The liberal says weakly, yes, it shouldn't be allowed, it's dangerous, meaning rhinoceros is running through town. I hadn't realized, but don't worry about it, it won't get us here, at which point we already sense that the conservative is being pushed rightward and the mild anti-fascist is doomed. Nor does The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, D-U-E, due, that's a Serling piece. Nor does The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, the most critically acclaimed episode of The Twilight Zone Serling wrote for its first season, aired on March 4th, 1960, make any effort to hide the rhinos, as it were, of a small American town. Unlike Cold War sci-fi of the 1950s, whose political positions can almost always be read through anti-communism, in liberal sci-fi, aliens are just different and sadly misunderstood, and turn destructive only if we fight them. In conservative sci-fi, aliens would be destroyed if it weren't for foolish liberal tolerance. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street reaches past the Cold War and further back past the global hot war, 1939 to 1945, back to the rise of fascism, and its use of the term fallout is the script's way of warning us against forgetting the lessons of World War II in our zealous fear of a Russian first nuclear strike. Unlike Rhinoceros, where language, so to speak, always stays in character and the rhino is not revealed as a device for political reading, Serling steps out, famously, from the fiction at the end of The Monsters, a human in a dark contemporary suit, deciphering rhinocerization for us, intoning, and I'm not going to do a Serling, but you can hear it. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices. Prejudices can kill, and suspicion can destroy, and a thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout all of its own. Pause. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to, another pause, the Twilight Zone. Perhaps this openness to interpreting the post-fascist analog owes to the difference between highbrow European experimental theater and the unsubtleties of American television in prime time. Or perhaps, too, something more is going on. Look closely at this Serling scene. A former RAF pilot, now gray-haired, sits in coach on a commercial jet on his way from London to New York, and then presumably to Los Angeles, where he now serves as a military attaché to the British consulate. Something seems wrong, but he doesn't know what, and it comes out in a checklist of negatives. Now, he's a passenger who happens to be a pilot. No loss of power, no telltale shimmying, no flame or smoke, nothing. No, nothing. Something has gone awry, and if he could explain it, the phenomena of life would continue in the usual where smoke thus fire denotative relationship. But we cannot go back to that word-world connection. Nothing remains of it, for this is the moment, as I have been arguing, where genre, in this case science fiction, converges with survivor testimony as a fully developed mode of representation, where, quote, silence became our guide, as the narrator of Aaron Appelfeld's halting memoiristic stories, Uncomfortable with Language, says in that survivor's strange first collection titled Smoke. The difficult silence Serling explores is that which Appelfeld struggles to create as he writes through the annihilation of language. It is Otto Pien's zeroist zone of silence that is not in fact empty. It is that which, as Paul Celan said, can remain unsaid because perhaps unsayable. Even now, the, quote, porous poem stands into time. For his book Silence, 1961, okay, there's a 1961 book here, an anthology of ways of saying there is nothing to say, John Cage included his lecture on nothing. There are silences, and the words help make the silences, and added a spooky note telling of a 1960 performance in which now, just then, finally the audience got the point and collectively refrained from asking any more of the questions to which the lecturer gave preset responses. In the poem Silence, Celan suggests that silence is shadowy rather than a set negative. It mixes the yes and the no. Back to Serling. The RAF officer's catalog of no in Serling mixes with affirmation and stands precisely into time in Celan's sense, and is artfully not meant to be empty, resistant, an empty, resistant word in Cage's. To his horror, the ex-pilot realizes that his having nothing to say is saying it as I need it. With Serling, we consistently see the darkly comic irony of Cage's aleatory assurance that we need not fear these silences, a key new response to terrors of the previous era. The list of scarily confirming negatives is part of a new paratactic language for sensing and then wisely confronting extremity. Serling's once authoritative person here is a passenger, not a pilot, on Flight 33 in an episode called The Odyssey of Flight 33, a teleplay written from a Serling story in 1960 and aired on CBS on February 14, 1961. The strange sensation the officer feels is a precise yet unimaginable something, immense speed without any of the usual corresponding effects. As the pilot and crew also struggle to comprehend such acceleration and to contain it, the jet pushes through barriers of sound and somehow of light. They are in radio silence because they are flying millions of years into the past. Lacking locating devices, the crew looks for Manhattan Island as a visual guide for landing at Idlewild Airport. How can it be Manhattan? Where the hell's the skyline? Where are the buildings? There isn't any New York. Soon they observe a dinosaur. Watch this on YouTube. There's a little dinosaur. It's like a little action figure dinosaur. Soon they observe a dinosaur munching the island's jungle flora. After pondering a course of action, they decide to repeat the maneuver and ascend to catch the jet stream. The reverse move seems to work. They gratefully see Manhattan again. But as they descend for a landing, they noticed that the air controllers reached by radio seem unaware of recent advances in aviation and speak outmoded technical language. The co-pilot glimpses buildings of the New York World's Fair. It's 1939. We came back, but dear God, we didn't come back far enough. Rod Serling's ultimate nightmare, and mine, and yours, is returning to 1939, the moment before the beginning of the end. The length of the airport's old runways are insufficient to accommodate the landing of a jet. But this can't be the only reason why these people decide to ascend again, and does not explain their surrealistic desperation to regain the final 2 decades. The story script Serling wrote for this episode makes the reason a bit clearer than the TV show. Who in 1960 would knowingly return to the moment before the World War and be doomed to repeat that history? 30,000 feet below, Serling writes, it was 1939, and the people gaped at wondrous exhibits. There was the waterfall in front of the Italian building, the beautiful marble statuary that fronted the Polish pavilion. He's not very subtle. The exquisite detail of the tapestry and wood carvings shown by the smiling Japanese. And the people walked happily through the warm June afternoon, seeing only the sunlight and not knowing that darkness was falling over the world. This is a facile politics of dramatic irony. Yet it makes for the one Twilight Zone episode in this period that ends with neither a final twist nor a resolution. Key otherwise to what was deemed the successful formula for popular sci-fi. The reveal here Serling meant not so much as a plot point as an observation about post-war epistemology, about what can and cannot be seen, known, explained, which is why perhaps the teleplay struggles to include the style of the story's final narration. The story's overt lyricism, spring, warmth, light, befits both the internationalist mood of wonder and a conventional sanguine focus on art. The reveal arrives in easily forgotten aesthetic detail as it constituted once a vista in the light. The artificial Italian waterfall, the Polish statuary, and the Japanese tapestry, all pre-modern, peacefully beheld by isolationist Americans and one wayward British ex-pilot from the post-disaster future. Both the mode of art and the artwork itself, all now gone, disappeared like New York City itself in the frightful, humanless prehistory we glimpse mid-episode, invisible in the dark that not only preceded 1939 but followed. This is an homage to New York, strikingly in accord with Tingley's sense of the viewer's experience as urban extirpation and chance reassemblage. What was important for me, Tingley said, was that afterwards there would be nothing. Afterwards. Serling's ending is meant to tie back to what the RAF officer had learned from the war about realizing illogical indiscernibles from negatives. Quote, no flame or smoke, nothing. The American woman sitting next to the former British pilot on Flight 33, after castigating him for being from a tribe, British people, unable to, quote, emotionalize anything, carelessly asks again, what did you say you were? Upon hearing his RAF rank repeated, she pronounces it wonderful and informs him that, quote, a nephew of mine was in the Navy during the Second World War. He was on a cruiser or PT boat or something like that, or was it a battleship? The imposition of her war remembrance further ironizes her criticism of her allies' alleged incapacity for creating emotional connection and experiencing therapeutic release. She had actually observed the Serling-esque truth that one can be outward physically sickened by repression. The American's inability to describe her own family's wartime experience with even the most basic information, her forgetting the distinction between a patrol boat and a battleship, contrasts the RAF officer's inability to explain what has gone wrong. Quote, there was this feeling that he couldn't describe even to himself about how the plane is responding. The two kinds of not knowing are different, and if you perceive them to be the same, you are fated to an inability to mourn. One mode marks the failure of testimony, and the other indicates its success. One is judged by Serling's tale to be casually irresponsible, hardly different from that of the blithe folks of 1939 living their warm June afternoon, thus doomed to repeat rhinocerisation. And the other is affirmed as the necessary new Cagean pataphysics of saying while not saying. One more paragraph. The captain of Flight 33 fully shares the RAF officer's lecture on nothing. Immediately after giving the passengers an initial deceitful anodyne update, "There is no cause for alarm. We'll keep you posted. If we run according to schedule, we should be landing in 40 minutes." They're like millions of years into the past. He begins to despise his own fate as an airline organization man. "Jesus God," he said to himself, "I should put on a gray flannel suit and sell toothpaste." But by the second update, he is in full rebellion against allegiance to the organization and smooth centrist circumlocucious appeals to reason, and decides to use the positive negative language already affirmed in the RAF veteran by radical narrative perspective. "Disaster defied utterance," as Appelfeld wrote when recalling his post-traumatic experience with languages in the 1950s, just before he falteringly began to write stories. And after disaster, he continued, "Smooth, fluent sentences leave me with a feeling of uncleanness of order that hides emptiness." Fragmentation, writes Maurice Blanchot in The Writing of the Disaster, "the mark of a coherence, all the firmer in that it has come undone in order to be reached. For fragmentation is the pulling to pieces, the tearing of that which never has preexisted, really or ideally as a whole." "What I'm going to tell you," the captain of Flight 33 says now to his passengers, "is something I can't explain." Quite aside from the dark comedy of a commercial airline pilot admitting he can't explain something, passengers and the episode's viewers experience the breakdown of traditional "I know, you don't" writer-to-reader narrative explanatory authority as the mark of a special strange coherence. "The crew is as much in the dark as you are." He then asks them to look out the left side of the aircraft where, quote, "those buildings down there aren't the United Nations." For the purposes of a representation of World War II in 1960, this anti-tautology, "those buildings are not the United Nations," the opposite of sanctioned technical 1950 speech, has both logical linguistic import and political valence. If you are used to getting your post-war bearings through easy recognition of an internationalist landmark, please note that the UN building you see is not, in fact, the United Nations, for its cooperative assembly has not yet been urgently needed. In the epilogue, Sterling emerges to say, with perfect pataphysical non-transparency, that the humans of Flight 33 are still straying from New York somewhere, not searched for because, quote, "fearful of what they'd find." Now, it is unclear who they is. Are they other panicky humans who are afraid to search and do not know there are living beings to search for? Or are fellow citizens of 1960 who fall into repetition of the horrors of 1939 to 45? And what the RAF captain means when he feels that he couldn't describe what went wrong is a disastrous, mystically collective dissolution of the self in Blanchot's sense. Each one restrains himself in preparation for the fall of the disaster, clinging to an other who is himself and is the dissolution, the dispersion of the self, and the restraint is sheer haste, panicky flight, death outside death. Thank you for listening to that. Thank you. I went on too long, and I apologize, but I hope you enjoyed that. Laynie, would you like to respond somehow to the book?
Sure.
Thank you.
Early this semester, when Al invited me to be a part of this conversation, he said, "You'll see how this book connects to the courses, modern poetry, and representations of the Holocaust." I mention this because a common critical investigation connecting Al's teaching and research involves reinvigorating the word and field we call humanities, with an insistence that a reader, meaning us, and a much larger us, bring not just our academic aspects, but all of ourselves to the work suggested here. The work of asking what it means to be awake and alive in this historical moment, what it means to be a witness and or a secondary witness to genocide, intergenerational and ongoing trauma, and to the perils of failing to move from spectator to one actively and somatically as well as intellectually engaged. If we don't know how we have arrived here, what do we know? What are the consequences of received meaning or not finding out for oneself? The artists discussed in 1960 do not shy away from passages in which, quote, impossibility of telling becomes subject matter. Telling breaks down. 1960 powerfully contextualizes artists whose inventions, innovations, are indelibly informed by war, infused with an ethical imperative to address atrocity and the necessity to create practices which resist a culture ignoring the failures of language. Al writes, the texts I consider in these pages describing a year of shift, turmoil, and turning collectively propose in effect that one must learn to hear such a nuanced distinction, word for word, inside the writer's effective obligation to language about pain. The linguistic turn in testimony arising directly first from extreme experience and second from contemplating matters of historiography. What if one were to choose to hang out in the inexplicable, conversing in a space nearly impossible to traverse in language, and yet trying in the process, noting artists who have inhabited this space, indeed forged poems, papers, canvases, scores, silences, actions, and leaps into voids? What if one chose to inscribe this pathless path that leads us here to, quote, narrative social intersubjectivity, multivocality, and the embrace of incoherence? Here in this dynamic house where artists and explorers of consciousness practice newly forged languages and language selves, this is one trajectory mapped in 1960, resonating now between we who speak and write, and those aspects of ourselves which find speaking, writing, and language inadequate to the task at hand. Here is a book to coax us to newly examine the open text, the one we might initially find illegible. Here is a book encouraging in its consideration of the constant necessity to invent language anew. Thank you, Al, for writing this book, which has me asking all kinds of questions about the inexplicable, the unsayable, and my own gravitation to artistic figures who are audaciously and courageously remaking a new language of reckoning.
Thank you, Laynie. That was lovely.
I was interested that it was 57 degrees out, making it easy for us to go out, because I was 10 years old in 1960. And a curious thing is that all of 1960 was 57 degrees. Listening to Al, I thought I could have redone my blurb in the following way for the book. Ba-da-da-dum, boom, boom, ba-da-da-dum, boom, boom. You are about to enter into another dimension, another dimension of sight, sound, and mind. You are about to enter into the Twilight Zone. Ba-da-da-dum, boom, boom. This brilliantly syncretic book confronts the repression of World War II in American culture, circa 1960. Filreis thinks through a constellation of songs, literature, poetry, and films, each pierced by the war. His linked essays show how great art is not only ethically necessary, but also a source of endless pleasure. 1960 is a tour de force of critical intelligence. I want to take a moment as well to honor Al for the 2021 Faculty Award for Merit from the Penn Alumni Association that Jessica mentioned. As I told a reporter writing about this, Al is a genius of institutional imagination, I mean this to connect to his work in 1960. Al puts together parts not otherwise connected to make a new home ground. He doesn't only lament what's lost, he doesn't only lament what's lost through malevolence and the passage of time, though lament he does, but he creates new spaces for inhabitation, as we have here at Kelly Ryder's house, or at Penn Sound, or in the thrilling syncretism performed in his magical new book. The Arts Cafe offers a manifestation of what I am talking about. In Al's social vision, the iconic mismatched chairs in this room become a concerto.
Thank you, Charles. So let's hear some questions, and then after a while we'll open it up to our audience. Who's got one first? Laynie, you first?
Do you want me to go first? Okay. I can't resist asking about this phrase, deciphering rhinocerisation. Can you say more about that, please?
Well, the 50s were all about everybody scampering to the center, or center-right, I guess, in an anti-communist era. And so you had theories, in quotes, such as Daniel Bell's idea of the end of ideology, which is something he worked on all throughout the 50s. But he published a book called The End of Ideology in what year, people? 1960, yeah. And that was celebrating the end of arguments between left and right, the end of arguments between laborers and people working in industry and their bosses, the end of that argument. And one of the candidates for president of the United States in 1960, the younger one, didn't talk about revolution at all as a Democrat. He talked about technocratic tinkering with the dials, getting things just right and turning it all over to the technologists. Artists, they resisted that, of course. There were countercultural movements throughout the 50s. I have a couple of dear friends who are very smart critics who said, Al, you're presupposing that the 50s was just a wasteland of, the center, the desert of the new criticism and of centrist humanism. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that was the culture that was in control. By the time you get to 1960, anti-communism, there's a thaw, and you get the emergence, finally, of a new generation of avant-gardists who really didn't have to play left-right so carefully, right? So rhinocerisation deciphering it is my job. This is no longer the 50s. 1960, 59 to 61, is a period where the thaw leads to re-radicalization, is the word that I use. So that lots of people who are staying center, like Daniel Bell, who thought of himself as a socialist, sociologist, but as a culture person, holy cow, a conservative, those people have to be discerned as rhinoceroses. And the book is not an ideological war against rhinocerisation. It's showing how it happens. But what it does is it celebrates people who found a way, because they were of a new generation or for other reasons, they found a way back to World War II for their animus, and before the war for a kind of radical modernism that had been stifled in the 50s. So that's why I'm all about. And when you read rhinocerisation in the 50s, it's a very different thing from what happens at the beginning of the 60s.
So I want to pick up from this often quoted aesthetic of yours of the mismatched chairs in the room and why that's appealing to you, which I think is part of your aesthetic. But within the context of the book, we could talk about collage, montage, palimpsest,
as a structural
recurring
device.
motifs.
Yeah.
So if you could talk about that interest that you have as a formal structure, essay as form, as Adorno puts it. It's a
Yeah.
very appealing and engaging and pleasurable book to read, and at the same time, it's extremely different than most professional works about periods. There are a number of books about
Yeah.
individual years,
Yeah.
and this isn't really like them, although
Yeah.
it's not unconnected to them in terms of the thinking. So
Yeah.
speak of the
boy.
organization of the book, the aesthetic organization.
Crazy ass organization. Philip, how did you let them publish this book? I really want the mic. I'm going to say something, but I'm going to put him on the spot. I want the mic to drift over to Philip, because I have to ask Philip a question about this. Is there a mic? Is there a portable mic for Philip? Okay, poor Philip. He's going to think about what he wants. Okay, so I intended to write a book about 1960, and it was going to have a chapter on the triumph of the therapeutic. It was going to have a chapter on the new right, the emergence of the new right. Barry Goldwater's A Conscience of a Conservative. What year? 1960. Yeah, you're right. There's the new right emerges. I mean, the Goldwater candidacy was really put off by Nixon temporarily. It's all coming. So I was going to write a chapter on that. And I was going to write a chapter on the universities at the end of McCarthyism. And then I found that when I was doing my research that so many of the people I admire were dealing with World War II in 1960 and hadn't been previously. So the question is, do you write a chapter on, Baraka in Cuba? Do you write a separate chapter on Ceylon's speech, The Meridian? Get into Appelfeld and leave a whole lot of other stuff out? So I decided to organize this thing in a collage sort of way. And you got a little sense of it. The reading was really mostly about Canticle for Leibowitz and Rod Serling. That's the easiest read there is. But it's, Cage is in there. And I decided to just do my research around a series of ideas and limitlessly put new stuff in as I saw that it was relevant. The manuscript I could have given to Philip would have had this as a chapter, the chapter about the return to World War II, and then a chapter on the triumph of the therapeutic. And as Jane knows, this was going to be 2,000-page manuscript, which would come right back to me. We're not publishing this. So then I began to regret all the things that I couldn't put in the rest of the book that I had wanted to write. And there's a lot not in there. Psycho, what year? Lily's getting the hang of this. Psycho's 1960. It gets mentioned once. Oh. Paul Goodman's Growing Up Absurd, 1960. Albert Lord's The Singer of Tales, is 1960. There's so much good stuff in there. So I really wanted to organize this way so that remember in the preface I read, it's not generically organized. There's not a chapter on poetry and then a chapter on theater and so forth. It's about a generation, and the only way to be honest and truthful about how a generation responded in its re-radicalization of the avant-garde was to have them all speak and obviously not prioritize a fancy experimental play over an episode of CBS television. So I didn't really answer your question.
Well, you did, but I mean, I think you're not putting forward what I would say is the radicalness of it in terms of the profession, since we're here at Penn, which is that everybody wants to talk about having books about things that are not talked about, or courses, and they're all about those single things. But the task of the essayist, in a way, the task of the scholar, the task of the artist, has to do with the relationship of those things. Because if you don't talk about what the relationship is, you're going to be constantly caught up in these little, Rod Serling-esque, the World Trade Center is not there. What happened to it? Because you're within the bubble. And this dealing with discrepant engagement in a Blakean way, because that's, to me, the model of discrepant engagement, the incommensurable, bringing things together that are not normally understood as being together. Of course, they're together in 1960, but even so, and making
Yeah.
it work. I mean, that's
Right.
the key thing.
Well, you
You
use
do
a
make
fiction.
it work.
1960 is a fiction. You know, they're just. I mean, you can see me at the edges cheating a little bit. You know, there are some pieces that really are later that I push backwards a little bit. And everything is really, when I say in parentheses it's 1960, I'm not lying. It's just that there are certain things that get written later, like Achebe. I have a section on Achebe's 1960 novel, but really I draw from Achebe some later work that he's doing. Okay, so 1960 is a fiction, but what a lovely thing for an academic to have to do. Create a constraint that radical, like nothing gets said that's not 1960, and see if you can come up with something that makes sense. Philip, you have a mic?
Yes.
Here's the question for you. All right, so you read this book in manuscript. Obviously, you came to like it. But there's a lot of... It's a kitchen sink book. So how does that work in the mind of an editor? And, who's going to... They'll buy it because it's a really great title, 1960, and and the design is beautiful. But when they read it, they're going to think, where the hell am I? Philip, you have the mic.
That's a good question. I think that's how readers think about culture. I mean, they take in a lot of different things, and they're not only focused on one particular author, but they're thinking about authors in relationship to music and thinkers and philosophers. And, it's something that not all academics do. And in fact, academics are sort of trained not to do that. So it was a nice way to publish a book where, the author was kind of speaking and putting together disparate things in a way that I think most readers actually do in their day-to-day lives.
Oh, I love that idea. Thank you, Philip. Laynie, another question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, I think.
Okay. We cannot go back to that word-world connection. Nothing remains of it. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that concept, which is so central.
Yes.
That obliteration.
William Shirer published The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich in 1960. The reviews of that book, does anybody own it on a shelf? You probably haven't read it. It's a big tome. He was, Shirer was a reporter in Germany for a lot of the years. Not a historian trained, but he had access to the Nazi archives as well as his own experience as a reporter. And he wrote this book. It's awful, I think. The reviews of that book were all over the front pages. Finally, the Nazi regime can be described completely and utterly. Finally, we've done it now. We've got it. We put our fingers. 1960, my year, and we're putting our finger on it doesn't need to be said anymore. It's been said. So in the middle of chapter 2, which is a crazy chapter that also includes Fanon, Baraka, Achebe, not people you associate normally with William Shirer, The Rise and Fall, Ingeborg Bachmann. I use The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich as exactly the reason why one should be reading awry. Because that book implies the opposite of what should be. The only thing worth saying in 1960 about the Holocaust, for instance, is what can't be said. The tome, bestseller, doorstop, everybody read it, and it finally answered all our questions. But did it really? When you read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, do you really understand the depth of racist hatred in that regime? No, you get it's a top-down center stage history. And yet in 1960, for whatever reason, all these really interesting artists began to try to say what couldn't be said. That's why the book opens with Baldwin, who was the best at saying, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, and that is why I'm trying to say it. How Cagean of him. And Baldwin was so acute about the relationship between the people of Harlem who had disappeared or were disappearing and the fate of the families of his Jewish friends and his interest in the relationship between anti-Semitism and essentially white European dominance. So give me Baldwin's gnosis any day. So yeah, the word world, what's the noun? The word world convergence or something
It's over.
is over.
Yeah, basically.
Yes, I'm not interested in the
Yeah.
word world convergence because it didn't do us any good knowing that. Shall we, Connie, can we get a mic to Connie? There are people watching on YouTube, so they want to hear your sound.
Was 1960 the year that Leroy Jones became Amiri Baraka?
No, that was later.
I thought it was a little
Yeah,
later.
I mean, but following the convention, I refer to him as Leroy Jones Baraka in parentheses once, and then it's Baraka. He went to Cuba. It's right up your alley, Connie. It was an amazing radicalization in Cuba. Everything changed for him. For one thing, he had been a beat poet. He was associated with the beats. He came back from Cuba and decided that basically he was a third world radical. He wasn't a communist, but he was more interested in internationalist convergences after that experience in Cuba. And it's one of my favorite things writing about in this book. Baraka and Cuba. I found the FBI file, and it's very interesting what the FBI thought of Baraka. In fact, most of what we know about his association with the Fair Play for Cuba, I forgot what it's called. Oswald was a member of it.
Fair Play for Cuba.
Yeah, most of what we know about the work of that organization for a couple of months in 1960 is owing to the FBI file. So, thank God for that. They're like the Nazis, Sorry. Saying archivally speaking, they were like the Nazis. The Nazis are our only source for so much information. The FBI for Baraka. It's a great comment. We know a lot about Baraka thanks to the FBI. Another question? Kevin.
Is it okay? I'm
Yeah,
circumventing someone else. It was such a
Hi,
pleasure.
Kevin.
Hi, Al. Such a pleasure to hear you read.
Thank you.
So I gathered that Eli Wiesel makes an appearance. Night was translated in 1960.
It was written in French, published in French in 1959 and translated in 1960, and it's only mentioned once, but yes, it's a 1960 book.
But anyway, I always think about other archives, and you guys over here think about America all the time, do. But I'm thinking you're actually much broader than I am in a sense.
Hardly.
And I wanted to hear you talk about the 1960s, maybe an expanded 1960s in the world and the interconnections between the various different reckonings that were going on around the world between, I'd say, 1956.
Key moment in your world.
Yeah, right. But it seems like it's all sort of matching up. And it's like there was also a modernist resurgence following 1956 in the Soviet Union, and these things are interconnected. Yeah, I do Russia mostly.
And 1956 is the revelation, Khrushchev's revelation about Stalin.
Right. And that obviously had a huge effect on American left politics, so there's that connection. But then I'm thinking about Europe and Holocaust remembrance. It's not a coincidence that Night gets published in 1960. It's like there's also a kind of latency with regard to the Holocaust.
There is a
in
latency.
Europe, and it's about this time.
So the main...
Yeah, so I just want... Yeah,
yes,
that's my prompt.
Thank you. The main moment, of course, is the kidnapping by the Israelis and the illegal extradition of Adolf Eichmann from South America to Israel. And as he's getting ready to stand trial, the world exploded with interest in, for one thing, the idea of survivor testimony, because the court decided to use survivor testimony. I'm not sure that it did any good, but they did. So it's a big moment, and there's a resurgence of neo-fascism across Europe, and a backlash to trials that were finally taking place. The Treblinka trial meant that people who were, woodcutters and carpenters and all these people who were hiding out in Bavaria were found, and then there was a backlash, and so Bavaria decided to vote for fascists, and Italy for 6 months had a neo-fascist regime. In Japan, when it was time to renegotiate the mutual security agreement between the U.S. and Japan, finally young people decided, no, that's not a good idea. And there was a horrible murder right on a stage of a socialist leader. Japan, the photo, which is a very important photo, is there. And you have Fanon giving lectures in Tunis, who has a whole beautiful section in one of his lectures about Khrushchev's banging his shoe, which took place supposedly in October. It's not really clear that he actually did, but but photos circulated, and Fanon had some amazing things to say about Khrushchev. It's basically saying it's not funny when one of the white guys running the first world takes off his shoe and bangs it in the Security Council when there's more work to be done. The Kafka revival happens, a lot of it in the United States, but in Germany. Paul Celan decides to continue writing in Germany. He's already decided that, but to continue writing in German, though he's living in Paris. Chronicle of a Summer, a brilliant film, the first cinema verite, first example of cinema verite, is filmed in August 1960, and it features a survivor of Auschwitz, Marceline Loredan Ivans, who wanders around Paris trying to get people interested in the fight against the Algerian War, that is to say, the resistance to the by then 7-year war, as an Auschwitz survivor. And the film is trying to engage French in looking back to their culpability during the war and forward to this Algerian mess and seeing them as connected. And the Sharpeville massacre occurs, and it is essentially modeled on the way the police behaved during Nazi Germany. There were a lot of interviews with police in Sharpeville after that. So, you know, finally, Aaron Appelfeld is in Israel not wanting to write in Hebrew. Poor Appelfeld. He was as a child, he spent several years wandering alone in the forests of Central Europe, and then went to a DP camp and was moved to Israel and was told by the Israelis, because this was the thing, forget Yiddish, forget Ruthenian, forget the High German that your mother taught you, your mother tongue, learn Hebrew. And he resisted that. He hung around in tea shops in Jerusalem with Gershom Scholem, trying to stay with the Yiddish, and they beat it out of him. They didn't beat it out of him. They coerced him to write in Hebrew. And in 1960, he writes his first bad stories. They're so bad, they're great. Smoke. It's a story in more or less unidiomatic Hebrew. And it's a resistant Hebrew. I've had some colleagues, Neely Gold here, Ariel Reznikov, have helped me understand that unidiomatic Hebrew. It is so resistant and so worried about the mother tongue having been ripped out of his mouth. He longs for German or Yiddish while he's writing Hebrew. So it is hard. I mean, it's hard enough to write the collage thing that Charles is referring to, and then to have to deal with the world, which I do inadequately, indeed. But it is a great thing to explore, because there's so much synchronicity in this particular moment where there hadn't been. The Zero Artists are another great example. Thanks for letting me go on about non-American things. Maybe time for one more, maybe John Giannotti.
Al, I hope you didn't think I was rude looking down at my phone, but I was just writing words that came to mind for 1960. And as soon as I saw the title of your book, I thought about the changes and the incredible changes that happened in that year, or slightly before or slightly after.
Yes.
And you know, I just scribbled down a few words. Tail fins on American cars, you know. They got their biggest in '59, and in '60, changes were taking place. I mean, the end of abstract expressionism and the beginning of pop, right in that era. All of us discovering. I was a sophomore in high school.
You're aging yourself.
Yeah, well, but the first time hearing Brubeck and Dylan in the fall of '60, I was in a marching drum corps.
You couldn't have heard Dylan in '60. He arrived in January of '61.
Yeah, no, but Hank Lekowitz played him in '60. We talked about that.
Sorry, John.
Good.
Dylanologist
Retort.
has been outed by a real Dylanologist.
Right. And I lost my.
Chubby Checkers is 1960.
What's that?
Chubby Checkers is 1960.
Yeah, but anyway, I think the collage approach is an amazing way to take it. I was in a marching band, and John Kennedy was on his campaign, and we played for him, and it was in September of '60, and it was just life changing to hear that happening at that time.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have anything to say about the Finns. But what was the second thing you said made me think of something interesting?
The end of abstract expression.
Abstract expressionism.
Yeah.
I was surprised. I mean, there really was obviously a backlash against abstract expressionism that hit its peak in 58, 59, and 60. And in chapter 5 of this book is about the Zero artists, who are mostly German and French. Yves Klein was sort of associated with them. Anyway, they really wanted to turn the corner away from abstract expressionism. Jasper John's painting with two balls was, of course, a response to Pollock, who used to go around saying, "You're no good if you don't paint with two balls," or whatever. And that the idea there was this counterintuitive hope. So the Zero artists, who were young at the end of the war, who had planes dropping, strafing them as they were little kids in Germany, so forth, came of age to produce an art that was not merely emotional or therapeutic, but actually was hopeful. Yves Klein jumps off a roof of a house or jumps out of the second floor window of a house in Paris and thinks of it as hopeful, not suicidal. And John Coltrane takes My Favorite Things, Oscar Hammerstein's one of his last pieces, and does not ironize it in my reading. He really, Coltrane thought, I want to play this, because he wants to write about his favorite things. He wants to compose about his favorite things. And that is a hopeful turn. So I'm finding in 1959-60 a surprising number of artists who have every reason to be nihilistic and cynical, turning away from fashionable existentialism and abstract expressionism, and actually being, even John Ashbery's collage poem Europe, which is 1960, has a hopefulness about it that is a surprise. And that is the origin of the 1960s that I care about. That counterintuitive turn back toward life, 15 years belated after millions of people were slaughtered. It took 15 years. Maybe that's the right amount of time. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Laynie and Charles. Thank you, Philip, for coming. So we have, it was described as yummy food in the not very cold, but also heated, tented books for sale. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
That's great. Wonderful.
That was great.
Thank you.
My notes, script, read on here.